He said, how do you know that? He said, how do you know? He's called Mike Marqusee. I said, he's one of my oldest friends. I said, well, he was one of my oldest friends because he sadly died very recently. He said, what, you knew Mike Marqusee? I said, yeah, we used to share a flat in Highgate in the 70s and the 80s, and, we hung out together. And he said, no, seriously, you knew Mike Marqusee? He said, I would have given anything to meet that guy. He said, I read his book on Muhammad Ali. I read his book on Dylan many times. I read, his book on the deracinated Jew. What's a deracinated? I don't know. Anyway, he said all these things to me, and he said, if only I'd had the chance. He said, you are so lucky. Well, Mike took us to Venice, and in one hand, he had the Stones of Venice by Ruskin, which I think Jeff referred to. It was hopeless. I mean, there was myself, Colin Robinson, then the managing director of Verso, and it became New Left Books, I think, then became Verso. Anna de Casparis, also known as the Red Countess, their newly born daughter, Lena, and every night he would test us on his, Stones of Venice and what we were supposed to have seen during the day. It was hopeless because we started the day with a joint. We then went to various in and out of, I'd not tasted Prosecco before Mike introduced me to it, so forget it, Charlotte Church. We were Prosecco socialists long before you discovered it. And, by the evening, by the time we got to the test, it was hopeless. Who was Bellini? Well, I thought it was a cocktail. I didn't know, so we failed miserably. So, this is Mike, the Stones of Venice, the Stoned of Venice. That was the problem that we had to sort of deal with there. Okay, I've shredded most of the rest of it, but Mike's singing, because the bohemianism of Mike, the love and the passion of his life, to hear Mike singing was adorable. He would, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Steely Dan, of course our beloved Dylan, but to hear him sing Bruce Springsteen's Badlands, boy, on the one hand, he had this kind of fantastic passion and love that everybody's described, but on the other, his singing did not hit any recognizable notes. And I am not a good singer, but compared to me, Mike was a disaster. But it didn't matter, it didn't stop him. And the passion, and actually, in a way, he was a real singer for that very reason. Because it didn't, technical things didn't disturb him. He was going to the heart of the music. And it was the same with his captaincy of cricket. He was a cricket captain. We used to go to the nets in Highgate Woods, and he would commentate as he was bowling. Now, the interesting thing is there was a real incongruity, there was a disunity between what he was saying and how he was delivering. It was hard to get, you could actually had to really stretch to kind of reach the balls that were sort of not coming anywhere near the wicket. But, there was no disguising his consummate passion for life, for cricket, for music. People have said all this, and I don't want to repeat it. Mike should have won, I think Achin said this, he should have won a Nobel Prize for talking. It was extraordinary. But, Mike, where are you? I can't make sense of it. It's my memories and views and feelings about Mike are completely dissociated, like this talk, to be honest. I don't make any sense of it. We used to watch telly together, and he would go on about these American comic series of the 50s and 60s, Car 54, where are you? Well, Mike 54, where are you? I can't make sense of it. Why he's not here, he went far too early, and it's, what can I say? I'm just going to conclude. You left a lot of life and love, and you showed us how to relish it while you were here. Stephen Unwin said, that he'd have given anything to meet Mike, that I was lucky to have known him. Well, those of us who knew and loved Mike know how true that is. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It reminded me, listening to that one of the only times that I can remember Mike must have been in a situation where he didn't have an audience. He was so frustrated because he was telling me about during the early days of his illness, and he was in a hospital there, and he was with one other person, and it was just when the sort of riots were starting to happen in Tibet, and he was trying to engage this one other person who was in a ward who didn't have anything to say. He tried to talk to them. You imagine the million different things that he could try and talk about. Not one of them, this other guy just wasn't interested at all. And then eventually this one other guy said, God, have you seen what's happening in Tibet? Phew, terrible that, isn't it? And Mike thought, at last, I've got something I could talk to him about. And he said, yeah, it's terrible. And then the other bloke said, I mean, you can't have monks running all over the place like that, can you? and he was quite cross at the time, but he couldn't help laugh. I'd like to introduce you now to someone who is, well, I'm sure many of you know him. He doesn't need a lot of introduction, but he's someone who fought and continues to fight in a way that inspired Mike and that in turn was inspired by Mike. Please welcome Suresh Grover.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Liz, for inviting me to speak. Mike was a friend, a brother, a comrade in arms of the Monitoring Group. The group is recognized as one of the leading anti-racist organizations in the UK, specializing in supporting families and communities suffering state racism, the bedrock of institutional and popular and sometimes violent racism. Over the last 35 years, we've become a prominent and permanent feature of the Black and Asian communities and their struggle for civil rights and state accountability. And through our national campaigns, we occupy a unique space in UK's social justice landscape. Mike and I worked together on many issues, including tackling racism in sports, building the civil rights and anti-war movements in the UK. One of my first conversations with Mike was about racism and cricket. Mike fell in love with the game in the hot summer of 1976, when Clive Lloyd's masterful West Indian side blew away Tony Gregg's English team. In his epic and riveting biography of English cricket, Anyone But England, Mike explained, "This is the first time I'd seen a black team play against an all-white team. In America, Jim Crow had kept black players in an entirely separate competitive structure until Jackie Robinson broke the color bar in 1948. I was therefore riveted by the 1976 Test series, not least by the way the evident superiority of the black players caused such anguish among the English commentators. As it happens, I also felt empowered by the 1976 series, but my perspective was driven by the experience of policing and violent racism. I'd been assaulted and stabbed by skinheads in the early 1970s, and coincidentally, the first test took place in the same weekend as the racist murder of Gurdeep Singh Chaggar in Southall on 4th of June, 1976. Rather than investigate the murder properly, the state responded by organizing heavy-handed policing of the locality. This triggered anger and violence on the streets, followed by indiscriminate mass arrest of young community activists. For us, both Mike and myself, the daily struggle against racism was being replicated at a larger scale on the cricket field. A test victory by the West Indies represented a blow against the English ruling elite and the establishment. Neither of us saw the cricket boundary as a realm free of politics. Mike's writing on race, class, and cricket were dynamic, new thinking, and inspiring. So was his activism. He and his friends had established in 1995 Hit Racism for Six in response to a racist article that appeared in the Wisden Cricket Monthly in July of that year. In this article, the known right-winger Robert Henderson argued that black and foreign players lacked the commitment to England, and it called for a Test 11 to be made of unequivocal Englishmen. This was something that Mike could not ignore. He was the inspiration, the intellectual driver, and the key strategist behind Hit Racism for Six. One of our first acts was to draw up a declaration to be issued and circulated around the world of cricket. Mike was its author. He was also key to putting together a publication that examined various aspects of racism in English cricket. hit racism for 6, race and cricket in England today. As campaigners, we threw ourselves into a number of activities, including writing to press whenever a racial incident occurred in the game, which often did in the mid and late 1990s, distributed leaflets out of the test matches, and organized a six-a-side cricket festival celebrating racial diversity in the game. Without Mike, Hit Racism 6 would have never got off the ground. Without Mike, the arguments against racism in cricket would have never been effectively put. His arrows were direct, and they really missed their target. As a result, despite the cover of privileged position and wrapped up values of the ruling elite, the English Cricket Board could not ignore the culture of racism that had bedeviled the game for far too long. During the same period in the mid-1990s, Londoners were confronted by the growth of the fascist British National Party. The party had established its headquarters in Welling, and the area began to experience a dramatic increase in racial attacks. By the time Stephen Lawrence was murdered by racists in April 1993, that area alone in Welling had witnessed over 4 racist murders in the past 18 months, and a BNP candidate had won a council seat at the local elections on a Rights for Whites platform. We were swallowed up by the culture of mass protests, some we ourselves had organized, and our campaigns around race murders inflicted either by the state or by racists on the streets. By the time we succeeded in convicting racist Stephen's murderers in 2012, nearly 2 decades had passed. The passage of time had witnessed a remarkable campaign, including forcing the government to hold the first ever public inquiry into a racist murder that exposed a litany, a catalogue of state failures. Its conclusions described the Metropolitan Police as institutionally racist. The state's failure to protect black and brown lives in UK had culminated in over 3,000 deaths in police custody since the 1970s and 120 racist murders since 1993. The campaigns and protests around the issue saw the revival of a national debate on race relations in this country. Mike was a constant companion and fellow campaigner of the monitoring group over that period. He wrote speeches, organized public meetings, played a central role in the development of the civil rights movement, and stopped the war coalition. Meeting families who had lost their loved ones and protests became a routine part of our lives, just like TV sitcoms and haircuts. These moments were filled with Mike's abundant energy, meticulous planning before meetings, and a ferocious appetite to debate. Although a brilliant communicator, sometimes his frankness would lead him to trouble, sparks would fly, and sometimes resentment would creep in. Mike wasn't there simply to help and support. He cared for people deeply. His politics and his personality made many of us believe that he understood our struggles and that our freedoms were bound up together, without if and buts, by a shared history and a shared future. At the risk of sounding ridiculous, let me say that Mike, for me, was a special being that you want to meet again in an impossible dream, in the midst of both sorrow and defeat, as well as painless and joyful victory, in a cricket field where life and nothingness complement each other. Mike almost certainly knew how we admired his bravery, both in his writings and in his activism. But regretfully, we never once ever told him how we loved the person much more. Thank you.
Thanks, Suresh, and all our speakers. Fantastic, because it's not just Mike's life we're going through today. It's the story of all of our lives and all of the causes and campaigns that we've been involved in. And I'd now like you to give a very warm welcome to Steve King, former leader of Haringey Council, was Mike's ward councillor in Hornsey Vale, which became Kelso-Pries, the most radical centre of politics Haringey had ever known. I can't imagine what the reason for that was, but Steve and Mike worked very, very well together. So please welcome Steve King.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, Mike and the Labour Party, I've been asked to speak about that, and so as it is the Labour Party, it behoves me first of all to thank Liz first very much for asking me to do this. And secondly, Liz, you mentioned John and Jeremy in your opening remarks and their results last Thursday. I'll always look every election at Leeds North East and I weep, because you two should have been there and you should have that sort of result.